Welcome to the We're All Dying podcast. On today's show, I talk with Barbara King about the grieving lives of animals. Barbara is professor of anthropology at William and Mary and a freelance science writer and public speaker. She is the author of 7 books. The book in which we will be talking most about today is called How Animals Grieve, which has been translated into 7 languages. And her TED Talk on animal love and grief has now received over 3 million views. Barbara is honored to be a new research fellow at PanWorks, a center for ethics and policy dedicated to the well-being of animals. I also want to acknowledge that during our chat today, a new dog in my home, a foster pup named Breeze, was very excited. And I kept apologizing and we were trying to restart. And Barbara just said, you know what? It's that dog's home too. So you may hear some dog noises, some snoring for sure. And I just want to thank Barbara for bringing that to light, especially in this conversation where we acknowledge other animals other than humans and their lived experiences. Welcome to the show, Barbara. I am so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here as well.
I feel like I'm with a kindred spirit today because I've been an animal lover my whole life and have often wondered about what's their life like. I know what my life is like with them, but today you're going to help us look into the grief of animals, which is such a remarkable space, so much more than just thinking about reducing animal harm or protecting animals, but really their internal experience. So I'm excited for that. I do wonder if you're open to sharing your first experience with loss in your own life. If you remember, was that a pet as a child, someone in your family? When did death sort of show up in your life?
Yes, when I was about 9, my maternal grandfather died. And I'd been closer to my grandmother, but still, this was the first absence of a major figure in my life. And I was very struck by the adult's tears and grief. It stuck with me. But even before that, I was maybe 4 or 5, and my parakeet died. And I wonder if this isn't the case for many people, that the first loss was of an animal companion. You know, what we used to call pets. I don't know that I like that term so much, but animal companion. And I really loved him. He's called Happy. And I went to his cage one day and he was laying out at the bottom. And I called my parents. And of course, they had to tell me. And the fact that I remember this, like over 60 years later, I think is telling. It was a sad moment.
Did they allow you to have any sort of moments with Happy after?
I don't remember that aspect, but I remember my parents being very kind and very gentle, but also telling me the truth. And we have always lived, my family and now in my marriage, with cats. And my parents once had to also tell me early on about the loss of a cat. And I think that their way of preparing me and staying with me and letting me cry, not telling me that it didn't matter, but understanding that it mattered greatly, was very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't hear that very often, right? We often hear that parents just sort of try and skirt around it. They say they
Yeah.
went to a different place, all these sorts of things without telling us the truth. And yeah, it's hard to tell a child that something is dead, but in this case, for example, you're better for it, right? You understand it. You're able to learn how to grieve from a younger age versus later in your 20s, 30s, 40s.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
And I'm grateful for that. That was, as I said, it was a good while ago, decades ago. So I thought that they were rather forward thinking in that way.
Yeah. I remember my first pet that died was a hamster, and I carried its little dead body around for days
Mm.
until it smelled. I remember my mom was like, okay, time for it to go. But, again, that was decades ago. And I just remember weeping, like just being inconsolable
Yeah.
that this little thing that I'd been playing with was gone. And yeah. What led you to working, on themes of animals in your writing and your research?
I think from, again, a very young age, I always felt most myself around animals and centered.
Hmm.
So all through school and, my adolescence, I was interested in animals and nature, marine biology, because I lived near the shore in New Jersey. And then I went to college and decided that I wanted to be a doctor. And that lasted 2.5 years, and the coursework was not going well. I stumbled into a course that taught me that I could make a career observing monkeys and apes, our closest living relatives. And I think from that point, I didn't look back, and I ended up in Kenya watching baboons for my dissertation. And then I just started asking more and more questions about how animals think, how animals feel over the years, and it just took off.
Wow. I have not gone into anthropology or any sort of scientific research around animals or humans. What is it that we need to kind of be aware of when we are monitoring, especially species that we might not be able to fully communicate with? Are there things that we should keep in mind when we're maybe labeling what we're seeing or describing like the experiences that we're having with them?
Yes, of course. Understanding animals' interior lives really depends on observing them very closely and then interpreting. Once in a while, I'm mistaken for an animal communicator when someone will tell me, oh, that's wonderful that you have ESP and psychic experiences with animals. And that is not me. I'm, of course, a science-based person making interpretations based on observation. And of course, it's possible to make mistakes, but it's equally possible to make mistakes with humans when we interact with humans, even if we request a verbal report of how someone is feeling. There's not always full transparency and everything else. So a word that I'm sure you're familiar with is anthropomorphism, which is the inappropriate projection of human qualities or emotions onto other animals. And I'm not so worried about that. I think we can very carefully understand that we're humans. We tend to see things through a human lens, but we can scientifically be very careful about how we do that. I mean, everyone knows that Jane Goodall taught us really how to go about observing other animals through her studies of wild chimpanzees, how it is possible to be careful in our interpretation, but really see something of what they're telling us about how they're thinking and feeling.
And do you think part of that's also recognizing how important it is to be in their environment instead of bringing them into ours?
Well, that depends because, of course, the dogs, cats, birds are in our environment, right? And so it depends on who we're talking about and which animals we're talking about. I certainly prefer understanding animals in nature if they're wild animals, not bringing them into a zoo or some other artificial environment. But for some of our domesticated animals, they are part of our lives, co-construct lives with us, and have been doing so for thousands of years. So it's a very contextual question. Depends on who we're looking at, who we're interacting with.
I love that. Do you remember your first experience witnessing something you would identify as an animal grieving?
No, I don't think I can point to a particular first. I started asking about animal grief after I was writing about human ancestors and the evolutionary trajectory of human responses to death, human community burials, and human grieving. And I just started thinking, if this is a part of our evolutionary legacy with early Homo sapiens, with Neanderthals in the past, what about animals living today? And so this occurred to me only well after my time period of observing monkeys in Kenya. And then I just started listening to, interviewing other people, paying attention. A lot of what I've done is documenting field work by others. I can tell you about an experience that I had observing grief, but it isn't particularly the first.
I'd love to hear one that kind of maybe moved you in a way that continued this research for you.
Yes, I'll tell you too. In fact, I was driving with a friend and we were chatting and in a happy mood, and we came upon, driving fairly slowly, a mourning dove that had been apparently just hit by a car, and it was clearly dead. He was clearly dead. And I believe it was a male. I'm not positive. His partner was in the road refusing to leave this body and kind of flying up and back down, or flying a little way and coming back. And you could just see the distress of this partner. And we know that many birds do bond as pairs. They know each other for many years as individuals. And in that moment, I just felt very moved and thinking about how this is another living being having a moment of anguish. And I thought about that quite a bit. In my own life, I've already mentioned that we lived with cats, and we had for many years an enclosure in our backyard that my husband beautifully built, very large and beautiful, for animals who were homeless and also under threat in our community. These animals were not welcomed by everyone on the streets in our community, and so we brought them to this large enclosure. And they were two white-colored sisters, named Kaylee and Haley. And I mentioned their color because they were very susceptible to cancer. They had blue eyes, white skin, and they were inseparable sisters. They slept together, ate together. And when one of them died of cancer, the other, who was Kaylee, we expected to grieve. And so we laid out Haley's body on a tarp. We really wanted Kaylee to be able to see and not just have her sister whisked away from her. And the other cats in this enclosure came up very, very closely to Haley and sniffed and looked closely. And Kaylee did the opposite of what I expected. She stayed maybe 5-6 feet away and just stared. She didn't move her body. She didn't move her gaze. She didn't come close to her sister. And as I say, this was unlike everyone else's response. And what struck me so much about that was this did not meet my scientific definition that I have published about grief. You're supposed to show some kind of altered behavior, failure to eat, failure to sleep, some sorrow, some body posture, some vocalization, nothing. It was quiet. And yet in my heart, I felt sure that this was her way. She just wouldn't leave and just stared and stared. And that has stayed with me for many years as well.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things in your book was this important acknowledgement that different animals within the same species might grieve differently, or we might not be able to identify what that grief is, or maybe not see grief at all. And so we can't just say if one cat does this, another cat's going to do this, or, for the whole group.
Yeah, in anthropology, we call that intraspecific variation within a species. And it is so prominent and really powerful because it tells us, of course, that individual birds, mammals have personalities, have different contexts. There was a very interesting report of a chimpanzee named Thomas who died about 10 years old in a sanctuary in Africa. And there were such different responses from the other individual chimpanzees around him. And it seemed to fall out according to closeness of social relationship. So the female to whom he was the closest in life was named Noelle. And she actually took care of his body in death. She took a tool and she cleaned his teeth, and she was being so attentive, whereas other chimpanzees seemed more curious than anything. And I could multiply with elephants and with birds. This is really showing us something about the power of the love that individuals feel when they're in connection. And of course, some animals are just different and they don't show their emotions, and we don't know what they're feeling.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, in your book, you talk about rabbits, elephants, cats, dogs, marine. There's so many different animals that we have put the effort into observing.
Yes.
Not to say that there aren't other animals that are doing really interesting, fascinating, heartfelt things. I remember there was a book called When Elephants Weep. I don't know if you've ever read that book or are familiar with it.
I know of the book, yes.
Yeah, I find that really powerful because they are such enormous mammals. And they, if they're free and they're not enclosed, they have such a large area in which they roam. Can you speak a little bit to how some of the research has shown how elephants respond to grief or loss within their groups, traveling? I won't take it away, but I'd love to hear kind of you share a little bit about that.
Yes, when I was studying baboons in Kenya, I was fortunate enough to be able to informally observe elephants. And I was there with some of the most prominent, elephant researchers, Cynthia Moss, Joyce Poole. And over the years, they've gathered a lot of information on elephant grieving. So those scientists and others know that if, let's say, a matriarch, a female leader of a family group dies, other matriarchs come close and they may try to at first revive the dead one, but soon seem to realize that that is not possible. Some females will rock over the body in clear distress or basically stand vigil at the body. It's interesting that males tend to come by the body and look, but don't seem to, as a rule, express that much grief, unless, of course, it's a relative of the one who has died. What fascinated me perhaps the most is if you can picture the savannah in Africa, grassy area with trees, elephants will be walking across as a family group and come upon a pile of bones. And one elephant in the group will pick up and start to caress the bones with the trunk very carefully. And the cool part is that the human researchers have plotted whose bones those were in life. They know who died there. And typically it's a relative of the one who died who is doing the caressing. So how do they know? How do they recognize the bones? But it tells us about elephant memory, elephant emotion. I do believe it is appropriate to use the word love and, of course, grief. So elephants are a real touchstone for us in understanding animal grief.
Why do you think it's important that we look at the grief of non-domesticated animals?
Well, I think we should look at the grief of all animals and ask questions. But if we're interested perhaps in natural behavior and how it evolves, we're going to see that in natural habitats with wildlife. On the other hand, I don't want to neglect the fact that animals who are in captivity through, no fault of their own, and I'm thinking here of farmed animals who are kept in captivity in difficult situations, they are also cognitive and emotional beings. And I want to make sure that we recognize that. I think people are often very fascinated with whales, orcas, chimpanzees, elephants, monkeys, maybe dogs and cats. But when it comes to animals that they eat, that I don't eat, but a lot of people do eat, there's a little bit of discomfort there. It's not that fun to learn that the animals on our plates have love and grief in their lives. So when we talk about animals, there's a really mixed bag here, both in terms of what we know, the questions we ask, and how people respond to that information.
Mm-hmm. As someone who has been trying to get people to look at the lives of the animals on their plate more than half my life, when I was reading this, I was wondering if, oftentimes we might approach those conversations talking about the actual, like, physical pain of the animals, trying to get people to understand the physical pain that these animals go through in these conditions. But maybe another approach is to talk about these emotional experiences because the animals have distress, have fear, have anxiety, have potentially grief, and all these other things contained in that space. And if anyone has ever been vigil or beside, one of those trucks that's full of animals, you feel the fear. You can almost smell the fear
Right.
of another animal. My body always just shakes. Like I just being that close to so many animals that they may know what's going to happen or not, but they're definitely feeling something. There's no denying that. So, yeah, I on my own personal level feel like this work is so important to help people understand those internal lives beyond just the violence, right? But the lived
Yes.
experiences.
Very much so. I'm wearing a shirt that says, "Have you hugged your chicken today?" Because we know that chickens feel the whole gamut from joy to sorrow, love, and grief. And I think there is greater and greater recognition of the interior lives of these animals all the time. But at the same time, we know that, for example, one of the world's most fascinating invertebrates, octopuses, are at great risk now of industrial farming, of our replicating everything that we've been doing in factory farming with pigs and chickens and cows and turkeys with octopuses. And I've devoted some of my time to trying to make sure that doesn't happen. And that kind of brings up an important point. I have absolutely no idea if octopuses grieve. I just don't know. And so my argument is not, oh, we need to protect and care for animals who have these deep emotional experiences and not the others, but rather I think it's a way to invite people to think more about the animals who surround us. And that, as you said earlier, we don't always know what they're up to. We haven't asked the right questions or been patient enough to really observe them.
Mm-hmm. And also, even if they don't feel what we feel, some of us still believe they have the right to live.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
we do.
Yeah. Um, what do you think is in the way of us understanding the grief of animals?
Oh, an obstacle, you mean, in the
Yeah.
way?
Yeah.
Well, I think, first of all, it's a very opportunistic endeavor, especially if you're a field biologist working out in the wild somewhere, right? You have to wait for an animal to die naturally. Clearly, we're not going to do unethical experiments where, we cause a death. So you have to have the right combination of a scientist who's interested in these emotional questions, an animal who dies, the ability to mobilize the data collection, hopefully with video, and then keep watching what happens around the body. There's a really famous case of an elephant in Kenya, a matriarch who died. And for the next 7 days, elephants came to her body, and they were elephants of different families. So yes, there were kin, there were relatives grieving, but there were also others showing a kind of generalized grief response. And that takes a lot of time, attention, and motivation to study around a body for that long. Just recently, there was a new article published about leopard seals who are apex predators in Antarctica. And there was pup death, in other words, offspring death. And the mothers were highly, highly attentive for up to 20 days and defended the pups from predators, and in some cases carried the dead one around. We see that with chimpanzees, we see that with monkeys, we see orcas carrying by balancing a body on their back. It's a maternal response that does seem to happen, but it takes so much patience to document that. So the leopard seal example was a new data point, and we're getting those all the time. So if I could just talk about that maternal response for a moment.
Please.
Your listeners may be aware of Tahlequah, who was an orca, very famous now, who in the summer of 2018 in the waters in the Pacific Northwest carried the body of her daughter on her own body. Her daughter had died within an hour after birth, and Tahlequah simply refused to let that body drop into the water. And occasionally it did, and she would dive and retrieve it. But she changed her whole behavioral routine, her whole approach to life for 17 days and 1,000 miles. There was a zoologist in England who wrote a very famous now column saying, it's in the mind of the believer to call that grief. We have no evidence. It's probably stress. And I just cannot understand why it is so difficult to see that this was a mammalian mother expressing her connection to her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
There was no confusion. Orcas have complex networks. They have their own cultures in the ocean. And many scientists, and I am one of them, are quite comfortable talking about love and grief.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Can you also speak to some primate experiences of mothers and their dead ones?
Yes, in chimpanzees and in some monkeys, when an offspring dies, a daughter or a son, the mom will clutch the body to her and carry it, and sometimes to the point where the body is really decaying and it's really not potentially a very pleasant experience. Now, sometimes what's interesting is that mother sometimes goes on to kind of carry out normal activities. It's not as if she is, an image of sort of bent over sorrow. So she, in one case, even made it, continued to eat, but she's clutching that baby. So again, we don't totally understand that, but we see it as not confusion, not stress, but again, an emotional expression of connection.
Yeah. Knowing so many of these stories and different ways of kind of showing up after a death or a loss, has it changed the way that you grieve in your own life? Have you noticed along the way? I don't know whether it's like incorporating things that you've seen or understanding your own grief a little differently.
I think so. I think it's been impossible for me not to be changed by that work and the work I've done subsequently. I've written a couple of books since I wrote How Animals Grieve, really trying to understand animals' interior lives and that motivation that gives us to be better with animals. About a month ago now, a beautiful cat named Marie died. She was a super clever tuxedo cat who was a spitfire and also, I will say, highly judgmental. And she ran the household. And she was my really special companion. And it's been very difficult. Excuse me, I spent many, many hours with her. She would be with me in my writing study. We would play together. She was just an extraordinary and I think exceptional cat in the way that all cats are exceptional. And in grieving, as I really have been quite hard for 4 weeks, I do feel it's hard to put into words, almost a solace, just knowing that the experience I'm going through is a multi-species experience. It's not something that only humans go through. I have said so often that grief and love don't belong to us. They are not ours. They are not human-only capacities. And it doesn't make the grief easier exactly, but it's that recognition that when beings love, what emerges from that is grief. And I don't claim that it's universal. I don't claim that all species grieve, but a good number of individuals in many species do. And I've always felt connected to the natural world, and somehow that just strengthens my connection to the natural world.
I'm so sorry for the loss of your friend.
Thank you. Thank you. I miss her terribly.
Yeah. Did she have other animal friends in the home, in your space?
I have to laugh because we have, as I said, lived with cats for so long, but we had a population in our home of aging cats. And one by one, they got old and they developed conditions and they've died except for one. So now we have one left. But I'll tell you, Marie was so much in charge that other cats were not necessarily her good friends, but more kind of got out of the way when she would run around in the house.
Yeah.
And what's funny about that is I'm just making this connection now. I was on a radio call-in show some years ago, and a woman called and said, I've lost my dog. My dog has died. I'm so sad, but I have another dog, and that other dog is not grieving. What is happening? What is wrong? And I said, well, that dog might be very pleased now to be the center of attention.
Right.
If there was no particular connection between the dogs, and maybe there is sometimes in some households, and maybe there's not. Again, it's not a given that any being is going to grieve in any situation. And she said, yeah, the dog seems kind of happy. I'm like, well, it's a very particular individual circumstance.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even just, one of my earlier experiences around death was working in a retirement community. And, the first time I was shocked when someone's spouse died and the living spouse was relieved. They were happy. They felt free.
Yeah.
Because they were married for, 50 plus years doesn't mean it was a good time. And so even in our, human animal lives, sometimes a death can not just be about sadness or sorrow, but actually maybe a freedom and a new sense of safety.
That's a really excellent example. And I'm glad you brought that up because it isn't like a binary, like, oh, animals can have all of these many types of experiences and humans are always sad. That's just not the way it works. I have had friends who had very difficult, bordering on abusive experiences with their parents. I mean, that does not describe me, but it does happen. And, you know, you cannot expect everyone to have the same response at death, as you well know.
Yeah. For animals that do have a special bond to one another, are there things that we can do if one dies and the other is in distress? I think you mentioned, showing the body. Is that maybe one of the activities we could do?
That's something I do now whenever I can, yes. And I think it's a habit that's been picked up by, let's say, wildlife rescue centers or some of the more enlightened zoos and certainly sanctuaries. And I think we can adopt that practice in our homes if possible, or we can also ask a veterinary practice to help us if there's one dog that is at the vet and is kind of, laid out in death. If it's possible, perhaps that's better than bringing the dog home. It depends on one's circumstance, bring the other dog there. I think that the embodiment of death, the sight, the smell, especially for some species, that smell is going to make all the difference, more so than for us, matters a lot. I always go back to the example I gave earlier of the cat Kaylee staring at her sister. And, of course, Haley died at the vet. And had we not brought her back, this would just be a sudden vanishing. I mean, how could her sister have made sense of that fact that, the dead one was just no longer visible? So, yeah, I think there are things we can do. And I also talk just about the incredible patience it takes to be with a survivor who's grieving. I think many of us know that from our personal lives, that we've learned there's no timetable for grief. There's no end point that happens on someone's, charted statistics. I wrote about a donkey named Lena who lost her best friend at a Canadian sanctuary. Her best friend was Jake and was a horse. So this was a cross species love. And Jake died and was humanely euthanized. And Lena stood on his grave night after night. She did not really want to eat, come in, relate with anyone else. And the sanctuary workers, kind of reached out and said, what do we do? And it was a matter of time and patience and allowing her to make that choice, while of course offering her food, water, choices, everything. It was right there for her. And then she did accept that eventually. But the profundity and the depth of some of these animals' grief just moves me very much.
Absolutely. Even, speaking sort of to their agency, like to allow them to choose how they want to grieve and how long they want to grieve, and giving them that space. It's not afforded to all animals or people. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Could you share a story about horses? That was one of the themes in your book. Is there?
Horses. Well, one thing that I did not know was that sometimes horses will form a ring around a dead horse. I mean, we know that often horses who have been taken care of well are brought out into a field and buried, and there's a mound. But sometimes now their body is laid out, and survivors will kind of come and just stand. And one thing that is somewhat of a pattern in the studies that I have carried out is a type of vigil, standing with the body and just choosing, as I had just mentioned, really for the donkey, Lena, but others as well. And horses will do that, and they'll stand for quite a while. And I'm often asked, is that a wake? Is it a funeral? I'm not so comfortable just, slapping a human label on those activities, but to recognize that there is not just an individual, but in some cases, a community response that's very quiet and still. We still ourselves sometimes, and so do other animals.
I think there was something in the book about crows doing something similar.
Yes, there's a very interesting debate going on about whether crows actually hold funerals. It seems to be more a case of, if a crow dies, a large number of crows will gather, almost in information gathering. Not to say that they're not feeling some kind of emotion, but that it may not be primarily kind of as like a wake or a funeral, but to assess the situation. And crows and ravens, corvids are just wicked smart. So who knows what they're up to, but they're really smart.
Yeah, absolutely. What's next in your journey of studying animals and their internal lives?
Okay. I could think of two things.
Okay.
I'm just putting the finishing touches on my next book, which is all about cats. So I'm so excited because I'm weaving together the personal narrative of my 60 plus years with cats with the latest science of understanding cats' thinking and emotions.
Wow.
And again, the kind of motivation here is how we can be better for cats in our homes, on the streets, and even those who are held in laboratories. We can do positive things. The other thing I guess I'd say is I just want to keep inviting people to think about what we can do every single day for animals. I have been informally just in my yard, just thrilled to be around, the box turtles, the spiders, the birds, the possums, the rabbits, the squirrels. We can make, if we live in a home, in an apartment, make little pollinator gardens or places for animals to be. We can make choices 3 times a day in terms of who we don't eat. And that for me is a joy in that work, in talking with other like-minded people and talking with students, because we know, of course, there's major, major crises going on in nature, and we can help. We can help every single day.
I'm so excited. The book that you're going to write, I believe, is going to be called What Are Cats Thinking? Is that?
The working title right now is Who Cats Really Are
Oh,
and How We
right.
Can Help Them Thrive.
Okay.
And I'm hoping it's out in 2027, but this is still in progress. So, things may change.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anyone that inspired you or was a mentor to you along the way that you'd like to give a shout out to their work, whether it's a documentary or a book?
Oh, there's so many people. It's hard to choose. I have been very moved by the books of Cy Montgomery. She's probably best known for Soul of an Octopus, but she also wrote, I believe the title is The Good, Good Pig. And one of the most astounding recollections of life with a pig that shows the depth of feeling and emotion for what are so often dismissed as farmed animals on our plates. And of course, I should always mention again Jane Goodall. I had the very great privilege of being at her home in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, meeting her several times, reading her work, teaching her work. And she, of course, was a pioneer. She was ahead of many of us. And in 1972, proclaimed that when the chimpanzee Flo died, her son, the chimpanzee's son, Flint, grieved. That was, a long time ago. And she knew that was true, and she was right.
Yeah, a huge loss. Yeah.
It has been. It has been.
I like to end this by allowing you to answer this question in any realm that comes to you. But what is some advice for the living, for the humans listening, and maybe the animals that might listen to this episode as well? What's some advice on living?
Well, to know that if you love, there will be grief, but focus on the love while you have it. And I think also that love survives grief. So actually you have love for a very long time. And when I grieve, I'm also genuinely grateful because it means that I loved.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much for the work that you do for those who don't
Thank
have a
you.
voice that we understand, but some of us are trying to understand, and for making the world a more compassionate place.
Thank you. And thank you as well for everything you do, Jenna.
Thank you so much for listening to this conversation with Barbara King. If you have a topic around death, grief, loss that you think we should explore on the show, please reach out and let me know. I hope something in today's conversation spoke to you and that you will pass it along to someone else in your life.